I like to begin to explain where I come from, why I do what I do, and why this is so important to me. This is a very personal journey. I am a single parent, married twice, 5 kids. I raised 5 kids by myself for 25 years. My eldest son from my first marriage, his first language is English, second language is Spanish. And at the age of 12, he sustained a traumatic brain injury by being thrown from his bicycle. Was in a coma for a month, on life support, flown to Daniel Freeman Memorial Hospital that used to be in Inglewood here in California, and lost all functionality, everything. He, at the age of 12, had to start all over again. The miracle was that he was alive. And I, as a single parent, I was flying back and forth between Dallas and here, trying to take care of the rest and take care of him, et cetera, et cetera. It was quite a journey. He had lost all language. And English was his first language, Spanish was his second language. And we had no idea what was going to happen for my eldest son, with him, for him, et cetera, et cetera. And one day when I was there on the ward with him, and he's kind of in a wheelchair, and all kinds of therapists are working with him. And a couple of the aides were Spanish speakers first. And remember, English is his first language, Spanish is his second language. And they were speaking to each other, and I saw him go like this. Actually, he turned the other way. Mm-hmm. And I went, look, something just happened. And the therapist turned, speech language pathologist and the specialist and the this, that, and the other thing, and they went, oh my gosh, something just happened. And I said, you could see, something happened here, and it is his eyes. And lo and behold, they got him back to full functionality, full fluency in 2 languages by going in through his second language back to his first language. I was astounded. And I said, what is going on up here? I had no idea. It was 1989. I was clueless. So I get on, I go back to Dallas, get on the phone. I'm looking up what happened in language, right? And I called Dr. Jack Fletcher, who was working with stroke victims at the University of Houston. And I said, Dr. Fletcher, you don't know me, I'm a mom. And I want to figure this out. And I explained the situation. He says, you want to come down and talk to me and I'll show you, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I went down there and he showed me through MRIs what happens with the brain when part is damaged and part isn't, and what's happening with language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It started my lifelong journey. I'm passionate about this, absolutely passionate. So over the years, and I was extremely blessed to be called by Secretary Page and the former administration, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, do you want to take over Title III? Do you want to figure this out? Do you want to make it happen in 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, et cetera, et cetera? And I said, absolutely. I know how to do this. I can do this. We can put in these structures. But the real reason I went was because I wanted to figure out the funding to fund research with language development in multiple languages. And I got to influence that agenda for IES. And that was my real goal, because I knew the other stuff. We'd been doing that in Dallas for years. It was that piece. And so that starts this third part of my journey. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here today. It's kind of launching into the next step. So, education neuroscience. When I say it's a new field of study, I know it's not new to all of you here in the room, because you're here. And I understand that you're curious. I understand what does this mean. And we talk about, how do we develop language or multiple languages through concepts, visuals, and math. And Nigel did a perfect demonstration, absolutely perfect, of what ELs need. We saw 3 things that they need. We saw language, we saw the visuals, and we saw the concept. And that's exactly what they need simultaneously, because it's about access. The key to learning for ELs, the key for all students, all children, is language. Whether it's visual, conceptual, spoken, reading, writing, speaking, listening, etc., etc., it is language. The field got really started in education neuroscience around language and literacy development in 2002 and 2003 when I got to influence the agenda and send funds over to IES and say, this is what you're all going to do. Now, what researchers you pick is up to you. I mean, we had no part of that, but what we wanted to figure out is what is going on in the brain when it comes to multiple language development, and especially multiple language development when it comes to attached to content areas and concepts. And in 2005, what you will begin to realize is that that's when the publishing started from the education neuroscientists in this particular area. This is language and literacy. And the education neuroscientists said, voila, the key to literacy, the key to learning to read, the key to cognition, developing thinking, is language and multiple language development. This is the list of education neuroscientists that we have been able to work with and continue to work with. And this is a short list because obviously there are many, 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 many more now in the field, publishing like crazy, and all of this information is available to you. So what is language? We've talked a lot about, what is neuroscience and, how do we learn conceptually and how do we learn to think using visuals and with, in a sense, no language, although it is language, conceptual and visual language. And you've got internal brain neural networking going on, right? But it's influenced by the external environment. And what the literacy education neuroscientists have understood is that you have to be explicit about your teaching, you have to be direct, and you have to be intentional. So when you're teaching language and language development simultaneously with content, you have to know what you're being asked to teach, why you're being asked to teach it, and you have to develop the language constructs around those concepts so that the students are learning all the time. I like the, let me see, I think it's this one.
Can you clarify, sorry to interrupt, specifically what you mean by language constructs? Like, can you give an example of a language construct?
I'm talking about the full, what we would call grammar, morphology, the pragmatics, all aspects of language. And the reason that's so important is because, as we know, the media is so easy to pick up, little buzzwords. Now everybody is teaching academic vocabulary. Well, that doesn't mean anything. Academic vocabulary, when you say, like word walls, without being in the context of the content area and what does it mean to really develop language in reading, writing, speaking, and listening, it's very limited. So really that's what I mean in the construct of language. The full battery, the full construct of developing language itself. So what I like about this particular definition is that language uses logical structures and real-world references to resolve obscurity. That, to me, is when I think about how do we think using language. How do we communicate? We communicate using language, and we use all forms of language in order to think and communicate. So if you take away, if you're ever doing any kind of meditation, if you're doing yoga, and you're just sitting there and you're just kind of letting thoughts fly, and you pay attention, and what are those thoughts? You're actually watching your own language, right? Right. Your thoughts are actual pieces of language. So it's really interesting when we say, can we learn without language? The answer is no. I want to move to where the language story begins and what the education neuroscientists in both Oregon and Washington have looked at is that we know that babies are born universal linguists. When a child is born, they hear every single sound that is spoken worldwide. It matters not what language it is, it matters not what country the child is in, etc. And every child is born with the ability to process all these languages. They don't start to discriminate from one language to another until about 3 months. And then they begin to discriminate, and that you can watch the tests that are being done, the MRIs and the videos being done with Pat Kuhl, University of Washington, where they tend to move toward the caregiver, primary caregiver, the mother's voice. And that process starts about 3 months to up to a year. The other interesting part about it is if a child is in a multilingual household, that the child will discriminate equally between both languages. It matters not. So if one of the adults or parents or caregiver is speaking one language and the child will discriminate one way, knowing that that's that particular language discrimination, and then if the other parent is speaking another language, the child will turn and discriminate to the other language. And it's really fascinating because you say, what is really going on in the brain? Well, the brain is absorbing and developing multiple languages at the same time while they are learning that content. While they're learning, say, object identification or definitions of objects, or I think it was Matt this morning did a wonderful demonstration of there is a chair, and when we know the action, we understand what chair is. Well, chair has a word to it, right? And it might be a different word in different languages, but we still know that the object has an identity, a definition to it. And so we know what the action is because we're taught. We're taught how to use those words to develop those actions. What they've discovered at Georgetown Medical School is that the language is processed exactly the same way, no matter what the language is. And if it's multiple languages, it's still processed the same way. There are 3 pathways. One is what you hear, so that you can discriminate the sound, whether you just heard that someone dropped something outside. Did everybody just hear that? You did, right? Way in the background, something just fell outside. Even though we may be paying attention to what I'm saying here, you still hear it. And so you're aware of that there are sounds going on around us, even if we're not fully aware. We also know where the sound comes from. So if I'm teaching in a kindergarten class and say I want students to understand sound and language, and so I'm going to say pick up a ball or something and throw it and ask them, where did that sound originate? So that they become aware of where those sounds are coming from and what is the sound and what kind of sound is being made. When we hear the sounds and we are processing sound to symbol, we begin to organize into language. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about also is that there's a lot of myths around language learners. And I've known this for the past, 30 years or so, where we listen to, I think Nigel, you gave a great example earlier in your presentation, where you say, well, if the student didn't hear me this way, if I just speak a little louder, even though they don't understand the language, they're going to understand. Or if I slow down and speak slowly, maybe the students will understand. Well, that's not what happens with language learners. Language learners are constantly processing language. So children hear 2 or more languages from birth. They hear both languages equally. Hearing both does not delay either one or the other. They are actually hearing them both equally, and they're developing both at the same time. There are optimal windows for learning languages, because you've often heard that, well, if a child hasn't learned to acquire English or a second language, say by the age of 3 or 5, then this student's going to be way far behind. It's absolutely not true. Not true at all. This is processing language from pre-birth in the womb all the way cradle to grave. So you can begin to learn language at any point in time. Now, if you're learning 2 languages simultaneously and to read in 2 languages simultaneously from the time that you're really little all the way through the primary grades, you're going to score really high on those academic achievement tests, including math. If you are transitioning from one language to another, and if you're an older student, it's really important that you must hear the discrete articulation of sounds. Because many here, I'm sure, have worked with students, both adults and middle school kids and high school kids, who cannot or challenged the discrimination between the B and the V and the D and the Z and a J, and depending on the first language or what's considered the child's first language, some of the letters and sounds don't exist in that language. So you're really teaching them from scratch as they're transitioning to a second language. So you have to be really clear, articulate, and discreet when you are teaching the second language and teaching reading in the second language. In other words, you can't take anything for granted, right? But what we've noticed is that whether it's from infants to 2s to 3 to 5 to 8, et cetera, through high school, is clear discrimination of sound. If a child does not learn any language, including sign language, by the age of 12 or 13, and I mean no language, then that window closes. And those studies are available at Indiana University. They've done a lot of work in this area around cochlear implants, but we're not focused on, children who are deaf as much as we are understanding how the brain processes language and the acquisition of languages. So this is what it looks like when kids are learning more than one language. You can see that there's an impact and an imprint on both sides of the brain, right? So this gets me back to where I was with my son. So this is what was going on. It wasn't just one side of the brain that was operational and working, it was both sides. So it led me to, well, what else is going on? Because we often think, and how many times have we heard, well, this is a left brain dominant learner and this is a right brain. Nah, doesn't exist. There's no domination between left or right brain learning. There's no specific time allotted to learning languages. Well, it takes 5 to 7 years. No research backs that up. Not valid research. There's a lot of opinion about it. It does not. It's about the instruction, the input, not about the output. No silent period in language development. And I'll tell you just a really quick story. Having been a single parent of 5 kids who are multiple language learners, don't you think I would have loved to have had a silent period with all 5 of them at some time? How many of you know kids who are silent? How many of us know that when we set up our classrooms for times for silence, that the kids are silent? Because we've said, no talking. Right. But if we let them go in their own environment, are they ever quiet? No. And when you're absorbing a second language, you're constantly testing it out. Dame eso, ¿qué es eso? What is this? Define this, tell me this. And you're either doing it with teachers, adults, or peers. So there is no such thing as a silent period. There is no preferred learning style. And what that means is we talk about kinesthetic learning, we talk about visual learners, we talk about auditory learning, we talk about auditory learners. No, all of this is going on all the time with all learners. So it has impact for instruction. All kids are universal linguists. And the one I like is hydration matters, because I remember a researcher one time was saying, make sure that the kids' brains are hydrated every 10 or 15 minutes. Well, there's no research that backs that up. Not that they shouldn't be drinking water, by the way, but I just thought I'd throw that up as a throwaway. As I mentioned earlier, older learners really do need to emphasize the distinction and the discrimination of the discrete articulation of sounds. You can use PVC pipes It's really easy and really cheap. So, what happens when we don't teach language and content simultaneously? We all know the stats. I am not going to waste time on it because we know what they are. They're abysmal. These are for English learners, and we can go subgroup by subgroup by subgroup. We must teach language and content simultaneously based on those standards. What's the solution? Educational environments, new ones, that optimize language learning all the time, all day. It's up to us to set it up. Highly effective teachers who are well trained, because higher ed doesn't do this, and we know this because we're administrators, so we're constantly having to provide professional development that's current and up to date for our teachers, because they're not getting it, whether they're veteran teachers in classrooms or whether they're coming out of colleges and they've just gotten their degree, 3 months ago. They're not getting the kind of instruction and information that they need to be effective in our classrooms. It's not about the teacher, it's about the institution. We need comprehensive and aligned systems and stakeholder teams. This is what, and I just threw this up here as a visual. When we talk about learning spaces that are optimal for language learning, it doesn't mean it has to look like this, but there's so many ways of doing creative environments, whether it's, early childhood, pre-K, kindergarten through 12th grade. We want to open up those spaces, lots of light, minimize, all the teacher artifacts all around the walls, et cetera, and let the kids just really have language development. This is how fabulous they are when they're learning multiple languages. And the one that is appropriate for today is understanding math concepts and problems, increasing reading comprehension because of word problems, right? And what was the other one? Using logic. So 21st century students need to learn the processes for critical analysis, induction, deduction, relational thinking, and highly communicative to express and demonstrate their thought. So our push is to teach how the brain learns. We have a call to action for English language learners. And this past year, I and colleagues opened the Education Neuroscience Foundation. It is located in Washington, D.C., and the mission of the foundation is that by the end of 2 years, we will be opening the Education Neuroscience Demonstration Lab School for parents, researchers, teachers, administrators, students all working together. And really to be able to demonstrate, you take those educational neuroscience instructional strategies and illustrate them in a real world environment for others to come in and participate and look at and adapt and adopt and take back with them and put them into their own environments, because the goal is to change the way we set up instructional environments and to teach the way the brain learns. Thank you.